Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by first time guest, Stephen Stapczynski. Some of you may know him from his really incredible Twitter threads. He's someone who makes Twitter worth using for me. But I was struck recently by a thread he had on LNG, both his pinned tweet on the history of LNG in Japan, but also on US LNG and the enormous turnaround in that sector from importer to exporter. We have covered natural gas before in the natural gas masterclass with Mark Nelson, but there's a lot to cover. And while that was a great overview, I'm looking forward to deep diving a little more of the liquefaction side of things and some of the trading, all different kinds of angles. Definitely back in the news with the Biden administration's pause on approvals for new LNG export terminals. So the timing felt right. And Stephen, I'm very grateful that you could make the time to come on Decouple.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me. It's great. I really appreciate it.
Okay, so Stephen, we did the masterclass, but I still would like to cover a few basics. I find like coal pretty easy to understand. Dig it out of the ground, move it in a train, put it in a big pile, light it on fire. Oil, that did take a little while. Just, I mean, as embarrassing it is, just to understand the refining process, distillation, all the different, the crack spreadsheet or whatever it's called, and obviously the multitude of uses beyond gasoline and kerosene and things like that. But gas still has this, I don't know, what's the word? Gaseous, unclear, invisible kind of element to it. And we're not going to focus on production today, but I guess, conventional versus fracking, but the pipeline networks, the storage, in the case of, taking advantage of arbitrage and shipping it, liquefaction, gasification, all that jazz. So that's what I'm hoping to kind of unpack with you a little bit today. Is this your main focus? Gas markets?
Yeah. So I'm a energy reporter at Bloomberg News, based in Singapore, which is a bit of a talent and trading hub for liquefied natural gas. So I do spend a lot of time looking at LNG. Asia is home to the world's biggest LNG importers: China, Japan, Korea, and then the fastest growing markets: India, Bangladesh, Southeast Asia, those places as well.
I do remember some stories coming out of the European energy crisis where the EU seemed to be gobbling up every available molecule on the spot market, and it really screwed Pakistan. Is that an area? I mean, it's in your part of the world right now, I guess. I don't know. I don't want to diverge too much
No,
into that, but if you have a comment or two, I'd be
I
interested.
actually that's something that I've worked on from day one. When the energy crisis happened, I cover LNG spot trading. So suddenly prices were getting very high, and Pakistan, according to the sources that we were talking to, and this was before the war even started, late 2021, when gas prices were rising and Russia was already ramping down pipeline supply to Europe. LNG prices were rising, and Pakistan wasn't getting all of the shipments that was promised for them under long-term contracts, specifically with two companies, Eni, the Italian company, and Gunvor, a Swiss trading house. And so, because of that, they had to dip into the spot market to buy some LNG. It was very expensive for them, and it cost them quite a bit, hundreds of millions of dollars. And they don't have the reserves and the cash to pay for that. It also led to shortages because after a while there just wasn't enough gas to go around. So as Europe was offering better prices, and not just Europe, other Asian customers, South America, Brazil was buying as well because there was a drought situation at the end of 2021 and into 2022. There just wasn't enough gas globally. And so what that means is the most cash strapped nations like Pakistan, Bangladesh, even India to an extent, they weren't able to get the fuel that they needed. And that resulted in shortages. And those shortages are blackouts. Those shortages are factories had to close, businesses had to shut. I visited Pakistan last year and met with a business owner that had to shut his his weaving factory, and shut dozens of looms, uh, and he was basically thinking about selling them because he could make more money that way because energy was just too expensive for the country.
Well, I think that's a good little kind of vignette to pique everybody's interest. Um, but yeah, let's zoom out a little bit. I mean, when I was reading your Japan tweet, I think you had an illustration of this kind of spider web network of LNG imports from all different parts of the world. Japan, obviously, pretty energy insecure in terms of, I think having burned through all of its coal for the Meiji Restoration, it was interesting interviewing a guy, a Japanese expert, and he was like, "Why did they build nuke plants in the Fukushima prefecture? Well, that was the coal heartland, and they used it all, and they wanted to keep industrial employment there." But it was just fascinating seeing this modern world and the way the energy interdependence. And again, going back to my original comments on coal being pretty easy to get your head around, and natural gas, despite sort of rising as a global share of primary energy, still kind of lagging far behind and having taken maybe longer than other forms of primary energy to really shine. Illustrate that a little bit by just talking about the complexity of the infrastructure required, both I guess pipeline, but then especially with LNG.
Yeah, I mean, natural gas, you can't just like pump it in and put it in a bucket, right? It's gaseous. So and there's a danger because it's dangerous. If you light it on fire, you can't see it. Oftentimes you can't smell it. They add that smell to gas. So all of that together, it's how do you even quantify it? So that in of itself is challenging. So the way that gas is produced at the beginning, it was usually just a byproduct of oil. They would just flare it, or they didn't think there was any use for it. As is the story with much fossil fuels, right? Gasoline was a byproduct no one thought they wanted, 100 years ago or 150 years ago, until you realized that you could use it potentially as a fuel for vehicles. So the same thing with gas. And then slowly they thought, there are ways you can burn this. There are chemical properties that you can use this in industries. And so there is a complicated infrastructure, which is pipelines. And storage was usually, instead of these, when you think about storage for coal, it's just a big old pile of coal. For oil, you think of these big oil tanks. For gas, yeah, there are gas tanks, but more often you just kind of stuff it back in the ground. And so Europe's gas storage is just giant caverns that used to have gas inside of them, because if you just poke like one or two holes in it, the stuff was already keeping the gas there to begin with. So you just put it back in. That's and then you have to use pipelines to transport it, and it's complicated. When you start to talk about liquefied natural gas, that's when becomes remarkably more complicated, and it took you know decades and decades to get liquefied natural gas and LNG to the way it is today, where it's basically a liquid market. It's not on the same level of coal or oil, but it is getting there, and the technology is interesting because you just need like a middle school chemistry background to kind of understand the basics, right? There are three states. There's a solid, gas, and liquid. And so when something is a gas, to turn it into a liquid, you just need to make it really cold. So when I was starting my career, one of the first projects I was on was LNG, and my bosses would explain simply, an LNG plant is just a giant refrigerator. So you turn the gas really cold, and you can put it into a ship. When it gets cold, it becomes denser. And so when you go from a gas to a liquid, all those molecules kind of shove themselves together. And LNG in particular, that gas becomes basically 600 times denser. So you're having a very dense piece of energy in the ship. The ships are specialized. You can't just put it in a bulk carrier. You need a specialized LNG ship to keep it cold, um, and then you ship it somewhere. And during that time, there's something called boil off. Basically, when it's so cold, it evaporates. And there's technology to stop some of the evaporation, and that had been an issue with the industry. So the longer you ship it, the more gas you would lose over time. So you want to get to the place as fast as you can. And then when you get to the port in Japan, for example, you have to go to a special LNG import terminal, which is the opposite of a refrigerator, which is like a giant oven, essentially. Put it through pipes, heat the pipes up with water and other things, and then it becomes a gas again. And then you put it in your pipelines, and you go places. And the LNG technology has existed for, you know, roughly a century, I guess, 100 years. Um, uh, but it didn't really become a commercial thing until the 1960s. It started off, the can I go into LNG history? How far can I go? Tell me if I'm rambling. But I can.
Oh,
I
right to the beginning,
I'm
right to the beginning.
so
I love it. My audience
so
loves
the
it.
U.S. The technology was essentially developed in the United States, and it wasn't like an international global form of transportation. It was like, let's liquefy some gas and send it to the other side of this lake, or send it down a river. It was really like small scale stuff for domestic US purposes. And because the US was sort of developing this technology, they were the ones who also, essentially started LNG overseas shipments abroad. The world's first overseas shipment was from Louisiana, which is where the LNG export terminals are today. It was to the UK on something called the Methane Pioneer. Um, Over 60 years ago. And then a few years later, the U.S. developed, with the help of investments from the or commitments from the Japanese, the first, the first U.S. Commercial LNG export terminal in Alaska, and that operated for.
Which it begs the question, because I mean, a lot of the LNG, superpowers are in really hot places like Australia or Qatar.
Yeah.
Um, is there like how cold do you got to get it to freeze? And then is there an advantage to doing it like up in Siberia and Alaska, or does it not make that much
No, it
difference in
does
terms of
make a
like the
difference.
economics and the edge or the
It
economics?
does. You hit the
Yeah.
nail on the head. Yeah. So you have to get down to negative 256 degrees Fahrenheit. And so, yeah, that there have been times I've covered heat waves in Australia that shut LNG plants because when you get to, I don't remember how hot it got. So I don't want to say something incorrect, but it was like close to record levels of heat a few years ago in parts of northern Australia, and the facilities would trip because the technology just couldn't keep up with the heat. Of course, it's not a huge problem. You can deal with it. There have been a lot of advancements. Qatar has figured it out, like with the help Chiyoda, again, it always goes back to the Japanese. The Japanese built the LNG plants in Qatar, a company called Chiyoda, and they've figured it out, and they've done a really great job at that. But there is one LNG facility, soon to be two, in northern Russia. One's called Yamal. There's another one called Arctic 2 LNG. The U.S. threw sanctions on it. That's a whole nother story. But those facilities, you need special icebreaker ships to get there. The water is frozen; it's very cold. And so, one of the things when they go on press tours and talk to folks like us in the media, they say, "Hey, our facility is competitive because we don't need to use as much energy. Like our costs are lower to freeze the gas because it's already really cold here." Now, of course, negative 60 degrees versus negative 256 degrees, there's still a big a big gap. So you need a lot of technology.
Delta.
But it does have kind of an advantage.
So I don't expect you to have the numbers to compare the economics of Qatar for against Yamal, but just on a more broad sense, like what are the like? I'm particularly interested in kind of like the energy economics, the EROEIs, or how rather than pipeline gas, LNGing it, moving it across the ocean, regasifying it. Like how do you make that comparison to pipeline gas, and how are the financial economics reflective or not of the energy economics of that
Yeah.
process?
Listen, I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible. But one way that people described LNG for a long time, and it still is to this way, they call it the champagne of fuel because it's, as I just described, all this infrastructure is not cheap. And so it is no coincidence that mostly developed for a very long history of the 60 years of LNG history, it was usually just developed nations buying it. So that's the Japanese, Koreans, Taiwanese, the UK. Um, for a long time, it was the US buying it. Developed nations were the backbone of the LNG industry because they could afford it. You have to pay more.
And why in particular? Was it because there wasn't enough coal, or coal was causing issues with air pollution, or like why was there this move? Because it's elaborate, as
Yeah.
you're saying, it's crazy, and like you have this great kind of biography of the Japanese pioneer on this, and yeah, I mean the guy probably met a lot of resistance early on anyway before his dreams were realized. So yeah, why were developed countries chasing champagne? And I'm not a connoisseur of liquor or wines, but I'm not sure what we'll call the pipeline stuff. But
Pipeline stuff is maybe
why did
like
it become such a thing?
it's just sparkling wine. I don't know. Or listen, the Japanese. There are a few reasons why they pursued LNG. I did write. If you go on my Twitter, S Stapczynski, Twitter X. You go there. The thread I have at the top of my page is about this guy named Anzai. He was an executive at a company called Tokyo Gas in the 1960s, and uh, one of the issues that Japan was facing at the time was that there was pollution, and it was smog produced from power plants that used oil, or when they gasified coal. They would gasify coal, they would gasify oil, and then they would also use oil for producing electricity, and that created a smog. And so, by no means is natural gas clean, right? It is still a fossil fuel. That, but compare, it doesn't have the same kind of polluting elements that when it's combusted, that other fossil fuels have. So when you burn it in a power plant, it doesn't create the smog. It doesn't create the NOx, all that other nasty stuff that comes with it, the soot that you would get with other fuels at the time. And so, Anzai would travel around the world. He went to the United States. He go to other places that had gas, and he would see that the cities were cleaner. You weren't choking on this air as much. And so he thought, man, wouldn't it be great if we could figure out how to import it? And the easiest way to ship it was by pipeline. There were just a few sort of experimental LNG shipments in the 1950s, and then when you came into the 1960s, as I mentioned, there was that shipment to the UK, and then the UK was trying to import from other countries as well, and that's kind of when the commercialization started. But the amount of gas that Japan wanted was a different level. They wanted much more. And so Onsite kept pushing this. And luckily, there were companies in the United States looking to export it. So it all kind of came at the same time. And one of them was Phillips in the US, energy company. And so they signed a deal with Japan to buy the gas. And Japan also, so okay, great. So you have the supply. Someone's going to figure out how to export it. They had to figure out how to import it and how to change the pipelines, how to build a LNG import terminal. So they partnered with Tokyo Electric. They partnered with a Japanese trading house called Mitsubishi Corp, and they got it to work. And they got their first shipment in 1969, I believe, the fall of 1969.
So just getting back, so I do want to try and hit on this that energy economics
Sure.
question, but
Yes.
before we do, just the use cases, right? So I mean, obviously, I'm thinking of Germany here and its relationship with Russian pipeline gas, but cheap natural gas is good for what? Electricity generation. What
Okay.
else?
So yeah,
Like you think about coal gasification in like industrial England, and it was used in lighting, right? That was one of the earliest uses of gas I've heard of. I think the Chinese moved a bit of natural gas around in like 1000 BC in bamboo pipes. But yeah, just like what's unique about it that we like, other than you said the air pollution
right.
benefits, no
So
doubt.
gas is used in a lot of stuff. So I think the one that people obviously think of, electricity. So there are gas turbines, gas fired power plants. That's pretty easy. Another thing that gas is used for, especially in cold places, like places that get cold, is heating. So gas, a lot of, for example, in Japan, again, to go back there, a lot of gas consumption isn't power plant consumption; it's heating. When you go to other countries, for example, India, China, a lot of the gas that they used are for industries. You can use it as a feedstock for fertilizer. You can use it for different processes in refineries and other sorts of petrochemical sectors. And so those are the three main things. It's power, heating, and industries are the use for gas. Now the economics, pipeline gas is the cheapest way to get gas. If you have, in terms of cost, you don't have to use all this giant infrastructures. You don't have to freeze it with these machines. An LNG export terminal, I've been to a few. They're the size of a city block. They're huge. They're enormous. And the ships are also big. They're all expensive. All this infrastructure costs money, and it adds onto the cost. If you have a pipeline, you've seen, pipelines are, depending on where you go, they take up some space, but they kind of just work on their own. You shoot them through. There's some pumps and turbines and stuff in there to make sure the gas keeps flowing, and then processing stations and things like that. And then you have to put them in the smaller pipelines, but that infrastructure is much cheaper. Now, the way that you buy gas uh, changes. So if you have a direct uh, relationship with Gazprom, you're probably buying gas at a link or a set rate that it would be lower than the gas spot market or LNG spot market. Um, and all these markets are kind of converging. But I think it's easy to say that if you have a contract, pipeline gas supply is most likely going to be cheaper than a long-term LNG contract, just because of the nature of the costs involved.
I know the numbers are bouncing around all the time, and that's for weather, climate reasons. That's for geopolitical reasons. That's for rapidly growing economic reasons like China. But I don't know if you can just give us like a ballpark or an example. I guess averages are just too hard here because again, the price swings around pretty dramatically. But just to get that comparison, is it typically like pipeline gas is like 40% of LNG prices? I know you
Yeah,
just can't do
it's.
that
I
because
mean,
it's
I
going to
can I can
vary
give you
depending on
I can
what
give you
jurisdiction we're talking
very
about.
concrete examples, and maybe this isn't fair, but I will anyway. The United States is a
Yeah.
major producer of gas. All the gas that you get, let's say, well, it's relatively Henry Hub, right? It's Henry Hub is the benchmark price for the United States right now, and that gas is transported by pipelines. Shale gas, it's abundant, it's cheap. But no matter where, every place you go, you kind of have to say, okay, how much is the gas in Russia? How much is the gas in Qatar? Blah, blah, blah. But let's just take the United States as a benchmark. So the US, the cost of the gas is about $1.50, $1.60 per million British thermal units right now. It's very cheap. It's some of the cheapest gas in the world at the moment, just because production is so robust in this country, and also it was a warm winter. Um, so that's one. Let's say $1.50, right? That's all you have to remember. Now, if you export it, we do something called a tolling fee. So you need to, the cost to turn it from a gas into a liquid. Generally speaking, that's not every contract. It's about you multiply that 150 by 115%. So let's say it's like, geez, I don't have the math, but like let's say it's like 170 plus $3. So now it's four, uh, 70 or something, and that's just the cost to liquefy it, and then the ship has to come and pick it up. Okay, and then if you bring it to Asia, Asian LNG spot markets, spot prices, if you, right now are about $8.50. So all of that together, you kind of get the idea. Domestic U.S. gas prices are at 150. Japan, if they want to buy an LNG spot shipment, they have to pay 850 right now. So and that's just, we're talking about spot market right now, two different areas. But I think that's just the easiest example because all that data is very transparent.
Beautiful. And then in terms of these LNG tankers, I mean, how much energy are they able to carry at a time? Like you think of them, I don't know, in medicine, we talk about like an IV drip, drip, drip versus like a bolus, like giving a big, and yeah, a large amount of fluids all at once. I don't want to get too medical here, but just curious, like there's a lot of these tankers on the sea. Like it's become the backbone of many developed countries around the world, and some that are developing. So I'm just trying to get a sense because it seems insane. Again, the complexity of this and just these ships. I don't know how many sail into Japan every year, for instance. What percent of Japan's primary energy is natural gas, and just like how much energy is on one tanker? If you can find a way to communicate that to my audience.
Sure. I think one LNG ship has enough energy, generally speaking, to power about 70,000 US homes for a year. So it's a lot of energy. Now, there are, hundreds and hundreds of shipments every day, but one uh, kind of fact that I really liked when talking about Japan is that one LNG shipment is the same amount of energy as a nuclear reactor for 1 month. So if you turn on a nuclear reactor in Japan, Japan shut all of its reactors, they're restarting them now. You need one less LNG shipment every month. So that's a lot of energy. Nuclear reactors produce a lot, so it can power a hundred for a single month. Tens to hundreds of thousands of homes. Um, and it's there are a lot every year. There's more and more LNG uh, being produced and on the water. So for a country like Japan, they import about 70 million tons of LNG a year. That's enough to power, I believe, about a third of their electricity mix, which is um, uh, pretty. pretty substantial. Maybe more than that, depending on the year and where renewables are going. But they do consume a lot of LNG there.
I did an interview with a Japanese energy expert, and he was describing the aftermath of Fukushima from the perspective of shutting off all these plants, the wild energy conservation that was done in terms of Tokyo office workers taking a hell of a lot of flights of stairs to get up places, temperatures turned down. There was a study claiming that something like 7,000 elderly Japanese a year died prematurely and some heat waves afterwards because there just wasn't enough air conditioning. I mean, that's wild. Taking 54, I think, gigawatt scale or larger reactors offline. That's a lot of LNG. I know it was replaced partially with coal as well, but do you have a sense of like what the cost was in terms of the fossil fuel imports to deal with that? I'm ambushing you with
That
with
that's
a.
that's a really, I
You don't
mean,
have to be too
that's a
precise.
really good question. I mean,
I've heard like hundreds of billions of dollars,
I
but
I, I think
don't have it at my
I
fingertips.
don't have the data in front of me, and I should know this, but when you think about it, Japan had to significantly increase the amount of LNG that they were in coal that they were importing because they had to shut these 54 reactors. The nuclear power made up about 30% of their energy mix in 2010 or so. Suddenly, you're replacing that with gas and coal, and you know if I'm looking at it just from the cost on the consumer, the cost on the on just businesses and households, the price of electricity went up 20 to 30%, depending on you know where you were and what kind of utility you were buying your electricity from, and it really threw a wrench in Japan's economic competitiveness, and that's why the country is they shut all the reactors, they shut all 54 of them, but when Shinzo Abe became prime minister a few years later after 2011, he really pushed forward a policy along with METI, the domestic industry and trade ministry in Japan, to restart the reactors, and every reactor you restart, the electricity price goes down for the consumer. The utility can instantly say, "Hey, we can cut rates." Maybe not a ton, but it's tangible. And so, while I don't have the exact number of the economic cost that happened, I mean, I think you have to look at it more than just the cost. It also hollowed out Japan's industrial, his nuclear industry. Japan was gearing up to like export nuclear reactors. They were going to be very similar to what Korea is doing today. They were in talks to export a reactor to Turkey. Japanese engineers were building reactors faster than basically anybody else. Kashiwazaki Kariwa in Niigata was built, and you know this better than I do. What, like 2 or 3 years? Just something really, just very, very
It was
quickly.
constructed in 36 months and
Yeah.
then brought online in 40, but I could be proven wrong on
No,
that. But
but
it
I
was
mean,
it
it
was
was
just
one of the fastest,
mental,
and it's the
ridiculous.
biggest nuclear power plant on Earth, and the safety checks, according to experts, probably should have been stricter, maybe there and other places. But overall, I think just looking at the fossil fuel imports is enough. You have to look at it wider, what people were paying, what they had to deal with, the hardship. This what you described is called setsuden. The people have to it's basically a practice of using as little energy as possible, as little power as possible. And to this day, they're still doing that, because even though 12 nuclear reactors have restarted under post Fukushima rules in Japan, uh, power supply is still very tight. They almost had blackouts a few years ago in the midst of the global energy crisis, which is wild because they can afford. We're not talking about Pakistan. We're not talking about Bangladesh. Japan has the money to buy the LNG. It's just they didn't have the capacity to produce the energy that they needed when demand spiked. Is a long way of answering. I have no idea what the number is, but it did have a huge impact on the economy and the culture.
Evasive but highly informative, Stephen. I like it. I like it. Let's pivot to Europe a little bit. The geopolitics of this all are absolutely fascinating. I had a German friend who was talking about, just over centuries, there's been a concerted effort by probably more like Western Europe to drive a wedge between Germany and Russia, because together, if those countries cooperate, there's a lot of synergism in terms of just insane amounts of raw materials coming out of Russia and the industrial base of Germany. Um, Clearly, they have not aligned well with the First World War, the Second World War. I'm not sure. My history is a bit spotty, but who blew up the Nord Stream pipelines? We're not sure, but there's been a massive shift in terms of certainly the gas markets in Europe being dominated by pipeline Russian gas, and now increasingly by U.S. LNG. So I'm really curious to wade into that story, the geopolitical sides, the technical sides, the historical sides, and I'm going to let you choose which angle you want to start with.
I mean, I think it's pretty clear that the German economy was built, designed on cheap Russian gas, right? There's data behind it. Germany used Russian gas from Russia, to create petrochemical industries, to power homes. It was the way that that was the future, and Russian gas was cheap and it was abundant. And people forget this, but even in January 2022, we were counting down the days until Nord Stream 2 was going to start. Uh, and then everything changed. Um, so that happened. But what I find really interesting is that there are a lot of people and analysts who say Germany made some bad choices in post Fukushima with shutting their nuclear reactors and that policy, connecting themselves with Russia in hindsight, according to analysts, was not the best decision. And you're seeing their industry being hollowed out. And even today, my colleagues in Europe published a story saying that industries in Europe are demanding lower prices and more support from government for energy, because they just can't afford things, and they're not competitive against the United States and China, where they do have the support and energy is cheaper. Um, that's all a big problem. But what I find most fascinating about all of this and all of these decisions is the pivot that Germany made to begin importing LNG. Because as I described as we've been talking, LNG infrastructure is complicated. It is not easy. But in the almost a week or 2 weeks after the war began, the government in Germany, from all the way from the top, they said we got to figure out a way to wean ourselves off Russian gas. And the way to do that is we need to start importing LNG. Germany had not a single LNG import terminal in February 2022. Now they have like 4 floating terminals. Now, there's a slight difference between an onshore LNG import terminal, which is one that takes years to build, and a floating one, which is a ship that you convert. It's called an FSRU, which essentially takes a ship and then it kind of messes with the guts a bit to turn it into a facility that can be designed to hook up to a grid and import LNG. And they were able to get several of these in record time and up and running by the end of 2022. And now they're importing LNG. They're trying to broker deals. They're in talks with Qatar. They're in talks with suppliers in the United States. Downstream customers in industries in Germany are already trying to sign contracts with U.S. exporters. So that all happened very quickly, which is interesting. And I think when you talk to specialists and analysts about this shift in Germany, they do say this was a historic, record-breaking change for a country to just put their foot down and say we need to start importing LNG and do it that quickly. No other country has, in the history, been able to do it in less than a year like they have. Now, that also comes with difficult, so there's the engineering feat, but then now you're importing LNG, you're importing the champagne of fuel. It's expensive. It's much more expensive than the Russian gas that they're getting. So now they've connected themselves to a fuel that will cost more for households and industries. Yes, they avoided shortages and everyone can continue receiving their energy, but the price is it's more expensive.
I know, again, it's hard to make price comparisons. So just in really kind of abstract or vague terms. I mean, yeah, I'm trying to get a sense of what natural gas cost Germany in the good old Russian pipeline days of 2020, 2021. I guess 2020 is a difficult year because the pandemic, right? There's so many features that are going to be affecting the price of gas. But um, can you give us some vague ballpark of like how much more expensive the champagne is than the whatever the flat white wine
Yeah, I
of
mean,
Russia?
I think generally speaking, again, there are many different ways to buy LNG. There are actually very many ways to buy Russian gas. So some Russian gas was sold on the spot market in Europe, which means that it would be almost the same price as LNG. But in terms of the legacy contracts, where before Europe had demanded that Russia switch over to the spot market because at the time the spot market was cheaper, and then it got more expensive. So that's another thing that, in hindsight, maybe that wasn't the best thing. I think in general, there's a view that U.S. LNG tends to be about 30 to 40% more expensive. So it's not double, but a long-term contract or spot prices can be quite a bit more expensive. And it's not just like uh, the analysts kind of looking at numbers and saying, oh well, it's this much more. The industries are out there saying we can't operate. There are chemical makers that have essentially come and said we need to close our factories. BASF has had to move operations elsewhere. Fertilizer makers just can't um, operate at these higher costs, either LNG or spot market. So while the exact numbers are in flux, I think usually folks say 30 to 40% increase.
So again, being a pretty fresh player here, and reading the European energy crisis through some pretty ideologic eyes, I think my nuclear advocacy has matured somewhat from kind of a bit of a religious fascination to something again a little more informed and nuanced. But the price went absolutely bonkers. I think it's not Henry Hub, obviously, in Europe, it's a Dutch name. I forget what
TTF.
Rotterdam something or other, but the TTF. And I was reading a Doomberg article recently, and now it seems like we're moving kind of back into an oversupply scenario. How did Europe fare? I heard they were spared by some pretty cushy soft winters. I think the mild winters are one of the only negative climate change feedback mechanisms I can identify, because if it's warmer, you burn less fossil fuels to stay warm. But just give me a sense of kind of where things are at now in Europe in terms of energy availability. We've talked about energy cost and how it's fueling deindustrialization, but those fears of Europe just simply not having enough gas, of people kind of freezing in the dark, seem to have not actualized. And people, after last winter, said, "Well, wait for next winter. It might be even worse then. It might be even colder. It might have a harsh winter." How close is Europe to kind of scraping the bottom, or really running into actual energy insecurity resulting in people freezing or things like that?
The chance of that is close to zero, according to analysts and both government and industry. I think we are the overall Europe is over the hump of energy shortages, and that's for a few reasons. You mentioned weather. Yes, there was warmer than normal weather. I think in the 2022 winter, and then again for the 2023 winter, it's been it was favorable. Uh, because of that, they were able to add a lot of gas to their inventory and storage, and that resulted in having a really good cushion. But I think one thing again, going back to talk about folks like BASF and other things, there was a huge amount of demand destruction in Europe that I think, to a degree that I don't think people and the analysts in the industry wasn't quite expecting. They were looking at their numbers and they thought, yeah, households are going to use the same amount of gas. Industries will use the same amount of gas. They have to, and in fact, they didn't. And even as gas prices have come down, industrial output is not really. It's coming back, but it's not back to levels where it was before the energy crisis. So the the output, the impact of this is that the market is a bit softer, and we're going down. We're not yet at levels, pre war levels. We are very very close. I haven't checked the numbers in the last about hour, but I don't think we're there yet. We're very close. So that's how close we are. So we might be back down to like the lowest level since like May 2021, which would be big. It'd still be more expensive than normal, but back to the pre war levels. But a lot of that has to do with just weaker consumption because it's capitalism. Markets work. When things are too expensive, people don't consume, and that's essentially what happened. And it's going back to the very start of this podcast. That's the story of Pakistan. Um, it was too expensive for Pakistan, so it went to markets where people could afford it, and that's just how markets work. And so it balanced itself. So Europe isn't in a place where they're going to see a shortage, but they are in a place where they're in a much harder economic situation. Industries are leaving. They're asking for more government support. Now, could we face another spike in prices that could raise power bills again compared to a few months ago? Certainly. The market is still finely balanced. So while we're not going to be seeing like worst case scenarios, losing electricity, losing heating in the peak of winter, you could see if there's a supply outage in the US or Australia or something, and then the weather gets too hot or too cold, you could see another spike in TTF, and that would, uh, that could affect consumers, that could affect industries again, and that's exactly why, despite the drop in prices, industrial demand isn't coming back because factories don't want to take that risk anymore. Why do that when you can go to places like the United States where Henry Hub is $1.50 compared to Asia or Europe where it's $8?
When we're talking about storage, particularly in Europe, this is a matter of national interest, national security. You hear about the strategic petroleum reserve for oil and the way that it's been used by the Biden administration to keep the price of gasoline down and all of the controversy around whether that was a good or bad idea. That's a different hydrocarbon and maybe requires different levels of storage. That was obviously in response to the OPEC crisis that the SPR was put in place. Can you think of like natural gas storage in Europe in similar terms? And who's ultimately responsible for it if it has such kind of national security implications? Like I heard Gazprom owned a lot of the storage facilities in Germany, for instance, and they were underfilling them pre-war. Has that changed? Is it like the SPR? Who's in control? The SPR, the government controls in the
No,
U.S. What's going on in
so
Europe with gas?
the gas is very much the storage is operated and used by the private industries and companies, but there is coercion, there is pressure from the government to hit targets. So I think it's like 80% by November, 90% before winter starts. By the time it starts to get cold, you want to have it almost 100% full. So the industries are encouraged and the companies are encouraged to fill that gas. So you see a lot of buying. When winter ends, that's kind of when that refill process starts again. So as we're in the spring and we're in the summer months, that starts to go up. It is not like the strategic petroleum reserve or any strategic reserves. There isn't really a strategic gas reserve. Now, that's something that the IEA and governments in Asia and Europe have been talking about developing, either a strategic LNG buffer, because LNG can't really be, because of the boil off and the fact that it's so cold, you can't really keep LNG for a long time. You have to turn it back into a gas. But there are countries like Japan um, that are talking about, hey, can we create a global? Everyone kind of buys like one more extra shipment just in case, sort of things that we're all ready. India has talked about developing a strategic reserve of gas, but it doesn't quite exist in the same way. Probably uh, because the industries have been able to use it successfully. And I do have to say, a lot of the companies that do use it are state owned. So while the government doesn't own it per se, the same way like the a minister will be like, we have to release the reserves or whatever the Department of Energy or Biden does whenever he SPR has a tender or releases. Um, it doesn't exist to that degree, but these companies are urged and they're usually state owned. So there is that kind of government connection.
Well, you can see it as a great way to. I mean, I guess gas is in its non-liquid form a lot less energy dense, and maybe there's a limit to how much you can store. Although it sounds like the storages are pretty massive, but certainly it's a buffer against volatile prices to be able to buy cheap and throw it in storage. That just seems to be common sense. But I've got a more sophisticated understanding now of the way government can kind of lean on private and state-owned companies to make sure things are full in winter. Do you have any information about that? Because I thought that was fascinating that Gazprom owned a bunch of storage in Germany and underfilled it. Is that rumor? Is that true? Do you know?
It's a little bit more complicated than that. So there are, let's say, every month or every week, there are things called like pipeline nominations. So there's supply that that Russia can tap, or other companies can tap in their pipeline, and say, okay, we're going to send X amount through this pipeline in this month, and this will be X amount available in this month, and then it will go into the country, and they'll buy up the pipeline supply and pipeline usage, and for to make it very simple, leading up to 2021, they were providing less and less, and Gazprom had a company um, in Germany that would receive the gas, and then also market it, and have customers. Um, Now, leading up to the war, there was less Russian supply going into Europe, and you know there could be many. Russia would always say, "Well, our customers are not asking for that much, so we're not supplying it." Right? There was never a time in 2021 where anyone was really saying, "Oh, we." No companies were saying we're not getting everything we want from Russia. Usually, they were supplying what they wanted, but they weren't. Even though prices were rising, they could have been supplying more. Right? They could have been balancing the market. They could have been doing more, and they weren't at that time. Um, Now, after the war started, there is a Gazprom unit that was uh, taken by the German government, and that unit um, was changed to a new company. It was called SEFE, Securing Energy for Europe, which is like the most patriotic change in nationalization of a company. And now that company, because they were like a supplier, and they had contracts, and they dealt with LNG as well. And they had contracts with LNG facilities, not just in Russia, but also in other places. And they were supplying LNG to Europe, but they actually even had a contract with India. But all of that together, that was an issue that Europe was dealing with. And again, another decision by the German government to um, secure energy for themselves by nationalizing this company that was part of Gazprom.
So in the time we have left, and I hope I've left enough time for it, I'm really interested again in what initially kind of drew me to you and to getting in touch with you and interviewing you was this great tweet you had on the history of the LNG sector in the U.S. and this just crazy story of retooling LNG import facilities for export facilities. So if you have another 15-20 minutes, I'd love to dive into that and get you to lay that history out for us because we've sort of talked to the market where a lot of LNG is going, but we haven't talked about the production. We'll leave the fracking. We've done that in other
Yeah,
episodes. So let's talk about the LNG aspect there.
yeah. I mean, the United States is today the world's biggest LNG exporter, which is crazy because they only started exporting LNG from the lower 48 states. Basically, they only started exporting shale gas as LNG in 2016. So, in 8 years, they went from 0 to 50, or, 0 to 90 million tons a year. It's wild what happened. And it's an interesting story because, yes, for the 1990s and into the early 2000s, the US was probably going to become one of the biggest LNG importers. There was a energy deficit in the United States. It was very dependent on overseas fuel. Gas was, becoming more used in for heating as well as for power production, and LNG was a way for the United States to continue growing and keeping its economy running. Um, but I won't get into the shale, revolution. You've obviously have that already, the shale miracle or whatever you want to call it. in the 2000s suddenly led to a glut of gas. So these companies, Cheniere, one of them, a company founded by this gentleman named Suki. He had big plans to build all these LNG import terminals, and he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And Sharif Suki uh, quickly pivoted. I won't get into the exact details, but essentially, there was an executive within the industry, someone who was very involved in the shale revolution, and he said, "Hey, can you switch these LNG plants around? Can you turn them from import to export?" And Suki thought, "All right, well, all right, instead of a toaster, I'll make it a refrigerator, right? Like, how hard can that be?" And so suddenly you saw that they were making these big multi-billion dollar bets, and this was all happening around 2010, 2011, and now we're getting back into Japan when the nuclear disaster happened at Fukushima. And suddenly there was an economic case because the Japanese are like, we need to buy a lot more LNG. And so all these LNG plants that were changing, you'll notice every plant has a partner, a Japanese partner. And let me pull up the data. I think it was something like between 2012 and 2014, 33% of all US LNG contracts were signed by Japanese importers. I mean, Japan was the backbone of of the effort to export LNG, the shale gas as LNG, which is really interesting because they were the backbone in the 1960s. So it's all
Right.
happening
What
again.
what's precious Yeah, what's precious about this is, the environmentalists who, oppose, fracking, oppose LNG, oppose nuclear, it makes for kind of strange bedfellows of various kind of anti-positions because as you're saying, the, LNG boom in the US was directly facilitated by Japan's desperate need and search for, energy alternatives as they shut down 30% of their, electric power generation. I mean, that is what a strange and crazy irony that is. In terms of going from import to export, I mean, I heard Henry Hub went as high as $15 per million BTUs. Like there was a strong case for import. I mean, this also coincided with the nuclear renaissance of the noughties, as we call it, with the plans for many AP1000 units and even ABWR units from Toshiba, as you're mentioning across the U.S. That all fell apart as the shale revolution kicked into gear and tanked those prices. So it must have been wild for that businessman to see that trend occurring, have conversations he did, and just turn around at a time and reverse the flow.
Yeah, I mean, it was really. I think no one was expecting it. You look at analyst reports from the early 2000s, and people were saying the United States was going to be the world's biggest LNG importer by like 2015, 2020. And this was, a- analysts get things wrong. But that
What would what would what would that have done to the? I mean, this is hypothetical, but like trying to imagine if the U.S. went from cheap white wine to having to import champagne. I like the economic performance of the U.S. in the last 10 or 15 years, even its sort of geopolitical situation, where for a while it was really not having to suck up to Saudi Arabia, or it was not as threatened by Venezuelan resource nationalism. I mean, it's just fascinating thinking about what would have happened in the U.S. had the shale revolution not occurred. But I guess particularly from that perspective of maybe being a little more like Europe, having to import this important substrate for electricity and for broader industrial production.
I
It's
mean,
wild.
the LNG industry, the shale production, all of that has been a huge boon for the U.S. economy. And it also happened right after the 2008 financial crisis, and there's an argument that helped the U.S. recover quicker than normal. And if we want to extrapolate even more, if the U.S. was an LNG importer, if suddenly Russia invaded Ukraine and Europe wasn't able to get LNG anymore, where would they get the LNG from? We would be in a much more acute situation. Um, you know, you talk to analysts, and people say that the United States essentially saved Europe. These LNG export projects helped Europe. Now the flows were redirected, right? There were people who couldn't get their LNG, again, Pakistan, Bangladesh, but Europe was able to get the gas that they needed at a high price. And what's interesting is that it wasn't always the U.S. who was making the profit. these LNG facilities had long-term contracts with Japanese buyers, as I explained. So the people who were selling the LNG to Europe are sometimes the Japanese. Like they weren't taking it back to their own country; they didn't need it. It was just the economics made way more sense for them to send it. So when you see all these LNG ships going from the Gulf Coast to Europe, it's not like always going into the coffers of American companies. It's a lot of times Asian companies, the ones that had signed these 20-year deals to get the gas because they buy it at the port. And then what do they do afterwards? They just bring it to wherever it makes the most money.
And you had a beautiful sort of naval navigation map of an LNG transporter doing a U-turn. Tell us about that.
Yeah, and it was I think it was before the war started, but there was prices were rising so rapidly that an LNG ship. So the Gulf, if you imagine your geography, right? The Gulf Coast, you have to go through the Panama Canal to go to Asia. So an LNG ship left the Gulf Coast, went through the Panama Canal. You got to pay a little bit of money to go through the Panama Canal. It's not cheap. You go through there, and they were going through the Pacific Ocean, and right as prices were really surging in Europe, you see the ship do a U-turn, then go back through the Panama Canal to go to the Atlantic to drop off. I forget exactly where it dropped off, but it dropped the shipment off in Europe because the arbitrage. They would make so much more money if they brought it there instead of to Asia.
So what's going on now in terms of like how do you read into Biden's freezing of approvals for new LNG facilities? Was the U.S. just building too many? Is there any concern about peak shale? Is this just a play to an environmental base?
Yeah.
Pre-election. What's your read?
So LNG facilities, they're the argument that there's too much LNG doesn't make a ton of sense according to analysts and people who look at this industry because what they tell me is that these projects are backed up by long-term buyers. So a project only moves forward if they have signed off like 80% of the supply or so under long-term contracts. Then they get the financing, then they get built, and then they move forward. Projects in the United States usually just aren't pushed forward without having the buyer in place. So, you know, the pause isn't really much about an oversupply. It does seem that, when you talk to political analysts, it does look like, Biden is trying to attract or sway maybe younger, environmentalists and folks who are more worried about the environment. Now, to be clear, again, LNG is not clean. It is a fossil fuel. Methane release is a big problem for the industry, and they've recognized that. At COP28, a number of companies that produce gas in the United States and abroad are looking at ways to zero out their methane emissions from production as much as they can by 2030. So the industry even recognizes it, and there are many studies. Not met. Well, sorry, there are some studies that say that perhaps LNG is worse for the environment than initially thought if you include the methane release. Those studies are still controversial. There's a lot of argument about it. So whether that is correct or not is still up for debate. But it is clear that there is a environmental impact that is negative by producing so much gas and exporting this LNG. And it does appear, according to the people that I've spoken with, and when you talk to analysts looking at what's happening in Washington D.C., that the Biden administration is reacting to that. Is it a smart political move or not? You have the Washington Post, you have the Bloomberg editorial board, you have people on the left and the right all kind of saying that this was a bad political move because this is a big industry that supports a lot of jobs. It's needed for our allies. I want to be clear: this pause will not affect any supply that that's under construction right now. The U.S. is going to double their exports by the end of this decade, so they're already the biggest exporter. They're going to be even bigger um, with this pause or not. It will affect projects after 2027 or so. Some projects already have buyers in Japan, in China, other places. So it could affect supplies going into the 2030s, depending on how long the pause lasts. And that is what consumers are worried about. Now, if they don't get this U.S. gas, there are other places they can go. There are other exporters. So the risk of a acute shortage in the market, um, analysts say, probably isn't really in the cards. But the risk of these U.S. projects not moving forward does exist, and that means that maybe buyers will go to to Canada even to get their LNG. Although some of those projects also have their own unique problems.
So I remember hearing about a fire, I think, at an LNG facility in Louisiana, and there was, of course, mutterings like maybe the Ruskies did this,
Ah, yeah, yeah, yeah.
as a way to make energy more insecure. I have some friends,
Sorry, I have to
kind of
pause
in
you there.
the
It was definitely there was
jump
no
in.
there was no
It
no
wasn't the
ev- there was
Ruskies.
no evidence that it was the Russians. I As a journalist, I have to just quickly say that.
Yeah, happy to have that correction. And I was speculating, to be very clear, or repeating rumors. Um, Okay, I would like to get quickly because this LNG finance thing, these long-term contracts that finance these massive investments in these terminals, which I gather are, I'm not sure how many billion. If you have some numbers on that, that'd be great. People talk a lot about the failure of the US to build nuclear, and they point to the oil and gas sector and say, we can still pull off, multi-billion dollar mega projects very quickly and very competently. Why can we do it with gas and not nuclear? Finance is a massive part of that in terms of the upfront capital costs to build a nuclear plant. Just something you were saying there about how these LNG facilities are financed, and the Japanese. I think it sounds like it's through these long term contracts, largely with the Japanese, but probably some others. Can you just talk about how you finance a project like this? How many years it takes to build? How much it costs?
Yeah.
Just rough
So like a
numbers.
normal LNG project will be in the billions of dollars. They're very expensive, and so to get the financing, no bank is going to come and say, "Yeah, we love your project. We're going to move forward," unless you have the buyers. So what you have to sign are things called binding sales and purchase agreements. So let's say a facility is designed to produce about 10 million tons a year of LNG. You want to sign on uh, most, if not all, of that supply under contracts that last 20 years, maybe 15 years or 20 years. And then the bank can say, okay, we know you have buyers. We know that you're going to be making a profit because the costs are X amount, but you're selling at a higher price. So it works out. And that's when you can make a final investment decision and you get the financing and you move forward and you can hedge it correctly and all of that. Um, I don't know how nuclear works, but for LNG, it's pretty straightforward. It's pretty proven, and it's a trusted model. For nuclear, obviously you need to lock in your purchase agreement from a utility, right, or the government.
I mean, internationally, there's a variety of different ways. The one that really fascinates me is in Finland. They have this Mankala model where I think it's a whole series of sort of power purchase agreements with number of entities, municipal utilities, industrial users, etc. And I think it's certainly a question that's being looked at, because precisely it has become impossible essentially to finance a particularly gigawatt scale reactor in the U.S. So I was just wondering if there were kind of lessons to be learned there. Obviously, the commodity that you're exporting from an LNG facility is much more liquid, no pun intended, but you're able to kind of move it, take advantage of arbitrage, et cetera. Although I guess if they're long-term contracts, not so much. I'm out of my area of expertise, but I think it sounds like LNG is more valuable than boring old baseload,
Well,
electricity.
to
But
that
again, I'm
degree,
kind of
but also do you think there's like a level of NIMBYism as well? Like when it comes to nuclear, like obviously you don't want like a giant LNG export facility in your backyard, but it's probably pretty easy to get the zoning done in like the Gulf Coast is lined with these refineries and LNG export plants, so it's probably easier to get it figured out than to maybe build a nuclear plant. I think unfortunately, the even the,
I mean, there's licensed sites. I think 15 or 17 licensed sites, NRC licensed, basically existing nuclear stations, wanting to add another couple of large reactors. So I don't think it's that, but we don't need to get too hypothetical there. I guess just one last question, and then we'll let you go. Again, just trying to get a sense of the energy in for this. These are massive terminals in British Columbia. We're opening one called the Kitimat LNG facility. It can actually be an indigenous owned and a non-indigenous owned facility on the same sort of waterway there. Um, BC has very, very ambitious emissions reductions plans. I think by the time they get to 2050, this single plant will be 40% of BC's emissions. And so they're looking for ways to electrify as much as possible. The process is there. What kind of energy goes in? Is it electricity? Is it burning natural gas to get those to power this giant refrigerator? What does that look like in terms of the the dollars and cents and the energy economics of that?
Yeah, it's both. So you use sometimes you can use either electricity from the you can electrify it, but more often than not, you're just using gas turbines on site. Um, Now the economics
To make the electricity to run the
precisely,
refrigerator,
yeah.
is that
Um, and
okay?
s-
Yeah,
and
makes
and
sense.
so the economics make sense because it doesn't cost as much as what you're selling at. So the cost of producing the LNG is never really a topic of it being or the the production cost has never really been one of the issues that has hindered the development of projects. It's more the cost of the gas that makes up the larger chunk of the pie. So if the cost of gas suddenly goes up in BC and they can't get that feedstock, that becomes the issue. It's not so much like how much money the electricity is worth or um, or whether the technology gets more expensive. It can get more expensive. You have to involve like carbon capture. That does increase the cost. And it was, for example, there's the Gorgon LNG export facility in Australia that was supposed to have a CCS unit connected to it because when you produce gas, sometimes the gas has some CO2 in it, so they have to split it, and then they're going to put the CO2 in the ground. But they've had some problems with injecting it underground because of water management issues, and they are not using the CCS at the full capacity, and that's costing them money and money. But it's the money that's costing them is in the millions. It's not in the billions. And so when you do see problems with LNG and the economics start to break up, it's when the cost of gas goes up. But usually in Canada and the United States and Qatar, the cost of gas is usually pretty low as we've seen. So that doesn't tend to be a huge worry.
Well, what's the best way to explain, again, the kind of EROEI? How like what percentage of the gas that would go into the tanker is being burned to run the super chilling
Oh,
refrigerator? I guess is my question. Do you have any way to kind
like a
of
percent,
understand
like
that?
a
And
really low amount. Um,
okay,
most of the gas will
so
make
it's
it make it to. I think every project is different, but I think again going back to the ROI of of a U.S. project, you build the facility which costs several billions of dollars, but you're
do you know how many billions? Several's
so
vague. Do you know how many billions? Do you have a
let's
sense?
look at the Shen.
Because nuclear plants cost several billion dollars. That can go from like 5 to 35 billion if you're looking at Vogel.
Yeah,
So
no,
just
I
curious.
understand. I think LNG plants will cost like about eight to $12 billion.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they're big pieces of infrastructure. Um, Now, the again, I'm struggling to get an exact number because every LNG plant is almost bespoke in the sense that they're all different sizes. So a U.S. LNG plant, which is maybe not on the small size, but like a medium LNG plant, is going to cost you about $10 billion. But if you go to places like Qatar, which is doing one of the biggest expansions ever, it's going to be maybe 4 or 5 times bigger than just a normal U.S. LNG plant that costs $30 billion. So whereas for yeah, I mean yeah, indeed. But for nuclear, I'm not. It's not cookie cutter, but a reactor is usually what like a gigawatt basically, right? Like one reactor. So you can kind of be like, okay, one reactor is going to be this much. But for LNG, because an LNG plant can be 4 million tons a year, it can be 10 million tons. In Qatar, it can be 49 million tons. It it kind of ranges. Um, and so clearly, yeah, there is the economy of scale. So the bigger you get it, the more you can make your money back. Um, but we are talking about projects that are certainly in the billions and not like in the millions.
So again, getting back to that question of why it's expensive. It's not so that the energy cost is huge. You're just taking some of that natural gas that you're piping to the LNG facility anyway, running some gas turbines, making some electricity, running the fridge. But it's more that you need a $10 billion
It's the
piece of
upfront
infrastructure to do
cost.
it. That's
Yeah.
the
and
upfront
then
cost,
and then
kind of like
also
nuclear in terms
you
of that
gotta
capital
you
upfront
gotta
cost.
buy the ships and you have to run the ships and you have to all these things combined, again, to make things more complicated for you, ships don't always cost the same. There's a spot market for chartering a ship, and so sometimes ships are really cheap. Right now they're pretty cheap. It's like $50,000 a day, but sometimes it can go up to $300,000 a day, depending on how tight the market is.
Stephen, this has been as I expected. Well, it's exceeded my expectations. It's been absolutely fascinating. You're a great guy to chat to. It's been a lot of fun. I particularly like these kind of LNG to nuclear comparisons because I just swim in nuclear all day long. It's a good kind of reference point. I'm thinking kind of like the LNG facility is almost like enriching the natural gas to like up its energy density. Obviously, you got to regasify it to burn it, but lots of interesting comparisons. I think we covered a lot of territory. I look forward to a lot more wonderful tweets. Everybody on here should um, follow you on Twitter right now. And yeah, how else? You're on Bloomberg. How else can people read your stuff, consume your
Yep,
materials?
just
We're gonna clip this and post some clips from you here. I'm sure very shortly. But yeah, give us a sense of how
yeah,
people
just
can get in
Google
touch with
me,
you.
Steven Stapczynski. I'm the only one, so you'll find me. You'll find all my stuff. I'm on.
And yeah, how can people read your stuff, consume your? We're gonna clip this and post. I'm sure very shortly.
So you'll find me. You'll find all my.
Can people read your stuff, consume your? World of our iPhones and our grocery stores and kind of the front facing consumer facing world that we are versus how the sausage gets made both agriculturally and industrially. And the valuations of this ephemeral world are mind blowing. So again, U.S. LNG apparently 27 billion a year in revenue. TikTok 9.4 billion in 2022. You hear about these major like commodities firms and their annual revenues just pale compared to some of the most silly bits of tech you could think of, and it does seem like that is rebalancing as the world gets a little more serious and maybe runs into some more pragmatic problems, geopolitical, multipolarity, etc. But that's I'll leave that for another rant some other time.
Excellent.
Stephen, thanks again.
Thank you very much.
We'll talk Japan nuclear soon.
Alrighty. Have a good one, mate.